Thank you so much, and so excited to have this opportunity to speak to all of you about really a different perspective that we can bring to economics. When we teach economics, we're talking about preferences, we're talking about occupations, and we're talking about consumption and production. And economics ultimately, and one of the reasons students are so interested in it, is because it is about what we do, how much we produce, what we consume, and how we decide to do both. But it's much more than that. And what we do and how we produce and how we consume comes to define us. It becomes a large part of our identity. So think of the most basic questions that you ask people. When you meet them, you ask them, what do you do? So I'm an economist. I'm a professor of economics at The Ohio State University. And these things describe me to the world. And think about other questions that you might ask. What was your first job? Now, if you asked my father that question, he would tell you an answer that would be very simple and would be straightforward. After graduating high school in Coffeyville, Mississippi, he moves to St. Paul, Minnesota, and his first job was at U.S. Gibson doing assembly line work on roofing shingles, and he earned $1.38 an hour. However, if you reframe those questions, you're going to get a better understanding of us as individuals, of our economy, and also of our society. So that first job, my father's first job, that U.S. Gibson job, is his first job because it was his first paid employment. It was years later that I discovered that it was not his first job at all. When my parental grandmother died several years ago, my cousins and I found my family's cotton picking books. Now, my father grew up as a sharecropper, where they worked land that was split 60-40 with a landowner. So out of the 40% that my father's family received, everything, the seeds, the tools, the living expenses, was deducted. And what cotton picking books did was they recorded your daily weights, the pounds of cotton that you picked every day. So my grandmother had dozens and dozens of these books over the years in which they had worked as sharecroppers. And being an economic historian, I knew that similar records were kept on plantations in the antebellum era. And they've been critical in economic history in allowing us to understand how the slave economy operated. So I took my family's cotton picking books and I used my skills as an economic historian, and I was able to measure their productivity, what they actually did far before paid employment. I compared their estimates to the estimates that we have for enslaved individuals on plantations. And I was shocked by what I found. I found that my father and his siblings picked as many pounds of cotton per day as enslaved people in the 1850s. This was not then some after-school job to put spending money in his pocket. And this wasn't helping out a bit, as the case may be, on a family farm. Okay? This was literally slave labor. And yet my father would never describe this as his first job. So all of this work, more than 10 years of his life, is missing when we ask the question, what was your first job? Because the presumption in that question thinks about paid employment in the economy that produces income. And when we don't have the real answer to that simple question, we're missing a critical component of his economic history, and his identity. So, why does that matter? Why does that have any influence? Why is it important? It's important because being a Black sharecropper defined my father and his family not only by what they did, but also by who they were, how others in the world would relate to them, and how they thought of themselves. This is back to that question of identity. To see why this is so important, let me tell you a very simple story. When my father was 12 years old, his mother sent him and his brother, my uncle, to this landowner for a small loan of $10, exactly $10. Now, in a sharecropping contract, there's a set amount of money that's allotted for sustenance, but in a family of 16 children, it may not be enough. Now, this extra money, this $10, would be paid back through the proceeds of the sale of cotton at the end of the growing season. It could also be paid back sooner if my father and his siblings did supplemental work. For example, picked peanuts or strawberries, sold wood that they had chopped, dug a ditch, something like that. Now, my grandmother needed exactly $10 because $10 would get you two 10-pound sacks of flour, which cost $6, a 10-pound sack of sugar, which is $3, and a canister of coffee, which is $1. So they go into town and they see him and they make the ask. And to go in there, they're led to the back in his office. And it was in that office that my father notices this jar, a very small mason jar, 3/4 of the way filled with $50 coins. As my father and his brother begin to tell him what they need and what they want to borrow and why they need to borrow this money, the landowner picks up that jar and he twirls it in his hand and he listens to them. And he twirls the jar some more. And finally, he speaks. I cannot let you guys have money like that. You will just have to make do until the next month. Even with the down payment made and the repayment for such a pitiful amount of money, who my father was and what he did was enough to deny him the smallest amounts of credit for literally no rational or economic reason. This was about more than money. And I don't want to make any mistakes. They needed the money, but it's about more than money. It was about a world that viewed him as a source of manual labor, only to work with his hands and disposable. This influences everything. It's why in the 1950s, my father went to a common school and did homework on slate slabs with chalk. Why their school year was so short, because time in school was less important than time in the fields. It's why you didn't use a front entrance, why you had to step off of the walkway if someone who wasn't a Black sharecropper happened along your route. The simplest aspects of life were designed to reinforce your place as a cotton picker, as a sharecropper. Always a renter, never an owner. Always a borrower, never a lender. Asking for money in a world with that sort of racialized inequality was a fool's errand. So as my father walked back home, he swore to himself that he would never, ever borrow money from any white person as long as he lived. How does that influence things today? That is the missing component in why my father had an extreme aversion to credit. why his insistence that we never use credit cards, didn't want his children to borrow money, it doesn't stem from innate preferences or risk factors. It in fact extends and comes from this part of his identity. It influences his consumption. When you don't buy on credit, even if you have excellent credit, it influences the things that you can purchase. So all of these lessons about consumption are in fact inherently tied to questions of production long before my father held his first job that we would define today as moving into the labor force. And I would be minimizing this if I just confined it to money. Right? The seeds of racial mistrust are planted there as well, and they're intimately related to economic forces. So these sorts of narratives are missing in our understanding of the economy and our understanding of ourselves as economic agents. Our questions about economic lives and the questions that we ask about people's economic lives are actually too constrained. Okay? When we begin to expand and let people tell the stories of how they've come to define themselves as economic agents, we will learn much more about someone's identity.